Alright, what's going on, guys, and welcome back. So today we're actually reacting to a video by Munching Orange that I actually thought was quite interesting and was a good video overall. I do have some different points to add to it and some of my own thoughts and stuff like that. So yeah, this is basically what this video is. Munching Orange, I'm sure you probably know. He's been a long time PokeTuber. I watched him a lot back in the day, especially during like X and Y season and stuff like that. Good guy. Go subscribe to his channel. Not that he needs a shout out from me. He's a huge channel. But yeah, we're going to be checking it out and sort of discussing. So if you came here for a Munching Orange exposed video, that's not what this is. But let's check it out.
Games have stayed 2D. This is a discussion I see all too often online, mostly by older fans that have been around long enough to see the main series evolve from cute 2D sprite worlds into the third dimension. But what if Pokemon remained 2D and Game Freak continued to hone the style they started off with? What would those games look like? And could they actually have been better than what we have today?
So I do want to state something just so you guys know before we get into this whole discussion, because I'm sure a lot of you know me as a longtime Pokemon fan. I haven't been a big fan of recent Pokemon games. I felt that there have been a lot of cut corners and stuff like that. I can't remember exactly how to pronounce his name, but the Jerry Can guy on YouTube, I'm sure you guys have heard of him. He made a video talking about a lot of the employee reviews at Game Freak, stating that like there's not a lot of time to develop the games and there's not a lot of willingness to change from a lot of the higher ups in the company. And I'm assuming a lot of you will just assume that I think the game should have just stayed 2D just because I think 2D is superior. That's not the case. I do actually like 3D games. I've just noticed a trend with a lot of games in general that when something becomes 3D, that especially if it used to be 2D, a lot of people or a lot of developers think that the fact that it's 3D is enough of an upgrade to justify lack of content. And that's not just something in Pokemon. Like, I've seen this across the board. So that's why I tend to lean more towards 2D games, especially like in the indie scene and when it comes to franchises like Pokemon. But I'm not against 3D games. I love 3D games. It's just, I found that in a lot of cases, 2D games seem to put a higher emphasis on content, at least in modern times.
You might be thinking, Munch, you're old, man. Of course you like the 2D games more. And while I must admit that growing up with Gen 3 does give me some nostalgic bias towards the 2D sprite style, my goal with this video isn't to determine whether 2D or 3D looked better, as I believe in terms of visuals at least, the answer is really a matter of preference.
See, he's right about that, because a lot of people will say like Gen 5 is the best 2D style. Some people will say Gen 4, some people will say Gen 3, some people will say Gen 2, right? I don't hear a lot of people say Gen 1, but that's very true. It's very much down to preference. What I will say is that the 2D sprites would evolve over time. So you would have like, and again, I'm not saying evolve as in get better, but they would change. They would become, slightly bigger, animated, whatever. So you'd have like the Gen 3 sprites that were 64 by 64. You'd have the Gen 4 sprites, which were 80 by 80 for the actual battle, like Pokemon battle sprites. I'm not talking about like the overworld. Overworld's another case though. Like, I like the Gen 3 overworld better than the Diamond and Pearl Gen 4 overworld, but I found in Heart Gold and Soul Silver they really honed that style, and I think it looks better. And then you have Gen 5, right, which the animated sprites are awesome, but not a lot of people will agree on as to whether or not they're the best, because some people don't like the animated sprites, some people do.
Instead, I want to take you all on a journey through Pokemon history to examine how the shift to 3D impacted the games in more ways than just graphics, and hopefully by the end we'll have a better understanding of just how much this transition changed the core of our favorite monster catching series.
Yeah, I just realized this video's 18 minutes long, so this is going to be a long reaction, so, strap in, boys.
So if you're excited for this trip down memory lane, don't forget to hit that like button, and let's begin with the dawn of this visual transformation. I suppose we should first establish when the shift to 3D happened exactly, and while most fans would say Pokemon X and Y were the first main series 3D games, we actually started seeing hints towards this future since way back in Gen 4.
Yeah.
A lot of objects making up the environment of Sinnoh, like the buildings and mountains, were actually 3D. And the same goes for Heart Gold Soul Silver, where we even started seeing some of these objects in movement, but Pokemon Platinum took things to a whole nother level. The Distortion World was probably the first time I remember really being wowed by graphics in a Pokemon game. Surfing around these floating islands sideways and upside down while this swirling black hole spun in the back.
Yeah, I guess this is what a lot of people would consider 2.5D. We see some modern games take that approach, like Cassette Beasts, Ento Drive, Mythcaller, which is in the works. 2.5D style is awesome. I also thought the Distortion World was dope as hell.
Background was pretty freaking mind-blowing as a kid. But of course, things would get...
Now, one thing I do want to point out, if you're like a newer Pokemon fan, like as in you've been playing since like Gen 6 and above, a lot of the emulators and videos you see on YouTube don't really do the older games justice, in my opinion, just because you have to remember how small the screens were that we were playing on. What, like for example, seeing this, you know, in you know, supposedly in 1080p from an emulator where it's all stretched, like this makes it look terrible. But when you're playing on a small DS screen, like it looks great, like it looks phenomenal. Even to this day, like I still have a DS, I still have Pokemon Platinum. I do want to point that out.
Whirling black hole spun in the background was pretty freaking mind-blowing as a kid. But of course, things would get a whole lot crazier in Gen 5 with Pokemon Black and White, which introduced us to unforgettable locations like Castelia City. I still remember my first time crossing the Sky Arrow Bridge and seeing the camera angle shift from the top-down perspective every other Pokemon game had been so deeply rooted in. And when you finally reached Castelia City and the camera zoomed out to show off the magnitude of these massive skyscrapers, this was the moment I think Game Freak realized the potential of Pokemon in 3D. It might not.
So I might have a bit of a more unpopular opinion, but I was not a big fan of how the cities looked in black and white when they went to that 2.5D perspective, if I'm being completely honest. I generally prefer the top-down sort of look because I don't know how to explain it. It just didn't feel like it fit with the rest of the game, I guess. I know it fit the theme, but that's just me. I don't know. Let me know what you guys think in the comments.
Look as impressive today, but at the time, these graphics were pushing the limits of the Nintendo DS hardware they ran on. You see, at the time Pokemon Black and White came out in the States, the Nintendo 3DS had already been announced and the DS was basically on its final breath.
Yeah.
This probably put some pressure on Game Freak to start improving their 3D capabilities for the next generation, as of course, since they began making games, all they've really...
Yeah, and they released Black and White 2 really late into the DS's life cycle, and I think that's because they didn't want to start a new generation on an old console. Like, imagine if Gen 6 started on... Black and White 2 were 3DS games. They wouldn't want to do that because they wanted to have a new generation be the first Pokemon game on that console. They've always done this.
Known as 2D Sprite.
Except with Let's Go. Let's Go is a bit of a weird one because, like, some people say it's main series. Some people said the developers said it's main series, even though they also said it's not. I don't count Let's Go for Switch, but other than Let's Go, that's pretty much been the thing the whole time. Like, you know, new console... like if a new console comes out, the first Pokemon game on that console is generally a new generation.
I mean, I guess technically Pokemon Coliseum and XD already existed, but those were developed by a different studio. So going back to Black and White, it took almost 2 years for the sequels to come out, and visually they didn't look too different from their predecessor.
And this is one thing I also want to mention. People always say DLC is better than third versions. No. Stop it. First of all, the first base games should be good by themselves. You shouldn't need Platinum. Diamond and Pearl should just be good on their own. But this is how you do it. Sequels, they might not make as much money, but in terms of consumer, what's good for the consumer, Black and White 2, perfect. You get the improvements that maybe they couldn't get with the time constraints, but you also get a brand new story. Like, this is the way to do it, in my opinion. Sequels are 100 times better than DLC.
Which makes me wonder if this whole time Game Freak was...
And no, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are not sequels.
Picking up something entirely different in the background. It's well known at this point that in order to fulfill the less than ideal goals of producing at least one main series game per year...
Which is self-imposed because they want to maximize profits.
Game Freak appears to divide their workforce into separate teams for
Not by Game Freak, by the Pokemon Company, obviously.
different projects. For example, in the most recent generation, we had an A team working on Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, while the B team seemed to be working on Legends Arceus simultaneously, and that's likely why we saw a lot of ideas from Legends cross over into the Gen 9 games. I have a feeling in the years after Pokemon Black and White, with the 3DS looming overhead, a large part of Game Freak were designated to work on converting the animated sprites they'd worked so hard to perfect into 3D models. A monumental task considering how many Pokemon already existed at the time, and one that would prove if Game Freak could continue to stay at the top alongside other veteran Nintendo franchises that had successfully transitioned to the third dimension years ago. Thankfully for Game Freak, the hard work seemed to pay off, as when the first trailer of Pokemon X and Y came out, I definitely wasn't the only one that nearly lost my damn mind.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There was a ton of hype for Gen 6, and a lot of people will say, well, if the 3D models are so bad and you guys don't like them and this and that, why was everybody so hyped for Gen 6? And the fact of the matter was, this was the first time they introduced 3D. The fact that they brought over all of the models at this point in time was amazing, right? Like, I remember when Gen 6 was announced, I was worried they were going to cut the national decks because I was like, how are they going to make all these 3D models from scratch? That's crazy, right? But they still managed to do it. And the thing was, while the models weren't super visually appealing, and there were small fractions or factions of the community discussing this, usually getting like, you know, shamed and cast aside. But while the models weren't as visually appealing as something like Colosseum or XD, this was their first shot at it. I think when it comes to the Pokemon models, the real issue is that they keep getting recycled generation after generation with minor improvements, whereas we'd get brand new pixel art for the monsters every iteration of games. Like even within the same generation, like I'm pretty sure, I'm going to have to double check, but I'm pretty sure even some of the games, like with Silver and Gold, they would have different sprites based on the game you're playing. Or if you have like Emerald versus Ruby and Sapphire, I think the sprites were different. I'd have to double check, but I know for sure like Diamond and Pearl versus like Heart Gold, Soul Silver, same generation, different sprites, like stuff like that, right? I think the models, the biggest problem is they feel like they haven't evolved, even though some of them have been improved upon. It just makes a lot of the generations feel same-ish. Like Gen 6 and Gen 7 kind of mush together, in my opinion.
When I first came up with the idea for this video, I kind of thought that X and Y were the first step in a downward spiral of quality for Pokemon games, but honestly, Gen 6 was kind of lit.
See, and I agree with this. A lot of people say Gen 6 was bad because the post game was this and that. Gen 6 was the first game that they actually brought everything to 3D. I gave them a lot of slack with Gen 6. The post game could have been better. There was a lot of, like, the games could have been harder. Gen 6, honestly, like, it wasn't bad. I don't think it was a bad generation. I think there were things that needed improvements, but I honestly don't think that Gen 6 was like the worst thing to happen to Pokemon. Like, I was very happy with Gen 6. I put like 850 hours into Pokemon X. Not that the amount of hours I spent breeding have anything to do with the game's quality, but it was just, that goes to show how hyped I was with the generation. I thought Gen 6 was a lot of fun.
Alone were enough to cement it as a banger, but X and Y still had a lot of the qualities that made classic Pokemon games so fun to play over and over, and I think they get a lot of hate nowadays just for having the worst story. But after the Magnum Open,
they had a pretty bad story, but I'm going to be honest, I prefer the Gen 6 story to the Gen 8 story.
that was Pokemon Black and White's plot, it was going to be hard to follow up regardless. In terms of graphics though, I think X and Y did a really good job of translating the aesthetic of classic Pokemon into the third dimension.
Yeah.
The world looked amazing and full of little details.
It's kind of like
me want to go search
a lower quality version of like
Pokemon. The characters.
It's kind of like a lower quality version of like Let's Go graphics, right? Like they're still kind of chibi, but they're still 3D. Like, I really like this style.
Somehow maintain the charm of the 2D sprites in the overworld while looking more realistic in cutscenes and battles. And then of course there were the actual Pokemon, which seemed to finally be realizing their true potential as we could now interact with the sprite creatures we all fell in love with in more engaging and immersive ways than we ever dreamed of. I know a lot of fans seem to think that X and Y were the beginning of the end in terms of difficulty.
I'm just going to speed it up a little bit.
Mainly because these were the first games that introduced the new style of EXP share, but at least back then, players weren't forced to use it. And I honestly don't even think the
okay, so the EXP share isn't an issue. It's the fact that you can't turn it off. That's my issue with it.
Here is why Pokemon games are so easy nowadays, but that's a topic for another video.
And also, yeah, that's another thing. The EXP share is not why the games are easy. The games are easy because they make them easy. Like Karina, the third gym leader of Gen 6, I brought a Honedge to fight her and only her Machoke could hit it. Like, it was pretty bad.
Video. Moving on to Pokemon Sun and Moon and their interesting sequels. Honestly, these
They're
games
not
weren't all
sequels.
that bad either. Sure, I wasn't as big a fan of Z-moves as Mega Evolutions, and this gen did start the trend of introducing a new gimmick every generation, but most of the common complaints I hear with Pokemon today didn't really become apparent until Gen 8.
Yeah, no, Gen 7 were bomb games too. Like okay, the stories were not the best in terms of like how much empty dialogue there were, but they were still fun games. That's all I'm gonna say.
Pokemon seem to face
like they still felt like they had content.
another rough transition from the comfort of our hands and into the realm of high-definition home consoles in Pokemon Sword and Shield. Well,
yeah, this is where we started to... I personally think Let's Go was the start of what a lot of people consider the downfall, but you guys can agree or disagree on that. That was the first like Dex cut slash like let's see how little we can add to something without and still get away with it and price it up at full price type deal. I'm not saying Let's Go is necessarily bad. I personally didn't like it, but I didn't like the fact that they only had 151 Pokemon and oh that's what they were trying to do. Like just because they're trying to do something that's not a good idea in my opinion doesn't make that idea suddenly good. But it just also felt like there was no like post game. They didn't add the Seviiles or anything. And it just felt like you weren't really getting as much as you'd get with like a remake like Fire Red or Heart Gold or Omega Ruby, right?
Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee came first, but it feels like beyond just graphics, Game Freak were really trying to elevate the Pokemon experience this generation with the introduction of concepts like the wild area, and can't say it really worked for me. Going from the
good on
carefully
paper.
routes of previous regions where it felt like
Good idea on paper, execution not so good.
every little rock and flower was deliberately placed in the most aesthetic way, to this open, barren wasteland where objects feel more randomly generated and lacking any sort of cohesion with each other, coupled with Pokemon not spawning nearly as often as the trailers made it seem at least, and it makes the whole world somehow feel less alive than previous games where you couldn't even see
The pop-in made it bad too, and the linearity of the non-wild area routes really caused issue.
Pokemon outside the grass yet. At least Pokemon Legends Arceus seemed to fix a lot of the problems I had with the more open concept of the wild area. It might be the fact that it's not an entirely open world and more like separate open areas, but even with hundreds of random items and Pokemon scattered about, it feels like everything belongs where it is, which is...
See, my opinion with Legends is I think Legends, they should have adapted more of it into the main series games with Scarlet and Violet. I like the semi-open world sort of Monster Hunter Stories-esque way of doing things where you have separate open areas. It would cause a lot less stress on the game engine for Scarlet and Violet, for example. Let's say there's the first area you can go to has like 3 gyms, the second one has 3, and then the third one has like 2 or something, right? This would cause a lot less stress on the engine because we all know they're not so good at optimization to begin with. And I just felt like they did a better job with sort of sectioning things off in Legends. I think there's a lot from Legends that they should have brought over to SV, and hopefully they do in Generation 10 or whatever the next Pokemon game is.
Just not the same vibe I get with the wild area and open world of Paldea. But I feel like I'm getting off topic now, and as I mentioned, this seems to be more of a problem with the open world rather than Pokemon switching to 3D. Though I suppose the two go hand in hand when it comes to explaining our next topic. Pokemon have never been strangers to trying out new features for one game and completely forgetting about it in future entries.
Yep.
I could list almost 100 ideas that could have been further developed and probably become series staples, but sadly just didn't get enough time in the oven. It feels like recently though, more often than not, these new ideas end up half-baked or just not as fun as those.
Yeah, like the Super contests were literally less than the contests from Diamond and Pearl. Thank you.
Games past. I mean, how many times are they going to rehash the Pokemon Tower when all I want is another Battle Frontier?
Thank you.
But without a doubt, the most notoriously cut feature were the Pokemon themselves. Everyone remembers the National Dex fiasco, right?
And then, okay, one of the biggest selling points of the new DLC is the fact that you can catch National Dex Pokemon in this new wild area Safari Zone-esque place with the, 4 different biomes. Like, I literally said this when the Dex cut happened. They're going to try to sell it back as DLC. And then everybody goes, well, you could just use Pokemon Home. But you can see how the main attraction of the DLC is being able to easily catch, those Pokemon without having to transfer it or without having to, have the Pokemon Home subscription or previous games or anything like that.
right? I was never too adamant about it, to be honest, since I find collecting more than 400 Pokemon in a single game way too tedious. In fact, I don't remember ever completing the regional dex in older games, so if anything, this was a pretty good
I'm a completionist. I have a living dex.
change in my book, and it
Well, up to Gen 7. I stopped trying after that.
made some sense at the time considering the amount of
I didn't want to because I'm scared to bring stuff from Pokemon Bank to home, because then I feel like I'm going to have a Pokemon Home subscription forever because no game will take all of them. Whereas with Pokemon Bank, I could transfer every Pokemon I have into my Ultra Moon version.
of work that goes into creating and animating every single Pokemon model, except for one little problem. They totally reused the models from X and Y. I've read some conflicting articles saying that Game Freak actually created new models for Sword and Shield, but
That's a lie. Data mining has actually shown that all the triangles are the same with a lot of the models when they flip them over, but some have received touch-ups to like textures and added triangles and stuff like that. You can't remake something from scratch and have the exact same triangles.
data mines definitely suggest otherwise. Not that I really have a problem with them reusing old models, as it saves a lot of time that could be put towards other things, like, sandwiches, I guess? This is my biggest gripe with the whole transition to home console. No, not the sandwiches, but rather the lack of fun features, specifically in the post-game compared to past generations. It's a sad reality, but a lot of the things that made Pokemon post-game so iconic back in the day are now reserved for the extra paywall known as DLC. I don't want to get super into the nitty-gritty of modern post-games, or lack of them, but it just feels kind of wrong how little we seem to get now compared to past games, especially considering they used to cost less too. And if the updated graphics are supposed to be what makes up for this new price, then I think I would have rather kept the old school sprites and animations
That's what I keep saying. Like, I'm not against the games being 3D. It's just like, I don't think 3D justifies a higher price tag when the content isn't there, if that makes sense. Like, I would rather pixel art if it means I get more content. 3D, I'm down for if the 3D looks good. I personally like pixel art. That could just be because of nostalgia. I'm 100% aware of that. But I personally think that Pokemon looked better when it was pixel art. Now, again, if you compare the Gen 3 pixel art to the 3D of Colosseum and XD, right? Obviously, it's going to be personal preference, but I remember when those games came out, I was like, oh my God, this looks amazing. But when Gen 6 came out, I was like, okay, like, you know, this looks cool. I just don't think that they're, you know, Pokemon is reaching its potential with its 3D. I think Pokemon could have amazing 3D games, but I don't think they're reaching that potential visually or content-wise, personally.
And challenging games. I know I've been pretty negative on the modern games so far, but it's not all bad, as the shift to 3D
No, BDSP is terrible. Don't say it's not all bad when you have BDSP on screen.
also brought along some of my favorite features in Pokemon, like the ability to customize our character.
Yeah, customization's dope.
It was possible to add this feature back in the 2D games, like we've seen in some fan games, but the protagonist being 3D makes them so much more personalizable and definitely added to that feeling of immersion within the world of Pokemon.
Yeah, I agree.
In games like Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, where we have just a few select outfits, every new playthrough feels a bit more unique by just wearing a different costume.
Yeah.
Then Scarlet and Violet came along and totally ruined it by forcing you to wear a school uniform.
They
but
did.
Anyway, another amazing addition that came with the 3D shift is the ability to interact with our Pokemon in ways that simply wouldn't have been possible if the game stayed 2D, or at least it wouldn't have felt nearly as engaging. Whether it's through picnics, camping, or good old-fashioned Pokemon and me, I absolutely adore being able to interact with these beloved creatures so many of us have bonded with and see.
So this I don't really relate to because I never really cared for this stuff. I'm just gonna let him talk and then
their reactions to getting pet on the head or even getting a ball thrown in their face. There's so many unique animations here, and I know Game Freak catches a lot of strays for reusing certain animations, but in general, I feel like the
You know what though? Someone made a video about how the Pokemon and Me /camp/refresh animations could be used into the combat system, and like it's actually true. They actually do have some really good animations in those like side activities. I have seen videos like sort of breaking that down, and he's right. Like some of the animations are actually really good. It's just for some reason they don't use them in the battle system.
Pokemon themselves look more alive than ever, especially in Scarlet and Violet. Sure, some signature moves, over-the-top animations seem to have been toned down when compared to Sword and Shield, but you could argue it makes battles snappier. Thinking about it, terastalizing feels like it takes...
I do disagree. You can have like over-the-top, like really cool animated animations. I said animated twice. Without making them super long. You could definitely like for example, the double kick animation, they just, I think they fixed it in Scarlet and Violet. I don't know, but in Gen 8, they just kind of hop. Like you could have easily just had a kick and that would have looked 10 times better, right?
Forever sometimes. Yeah, I'm okay with move animations getting toned down a bit. Honestly, I wish we could just skip all these cutscenes, but you can really see just how much work Game Freak put into updating some of these models and animations with their love child Charizard, who might just have had the biggest glow up I've ever seen.
Yeah, I have noticed in SV they have I think Scarlet and Violet was and I'm not justifying the Dex cut, but if they were gonna Dex cut, I think Scarlet and Violet would have been the games to actually say this is what we're doing. Now, again, Scarlet and Violet has a myriad of issues. Enjoyable game, but myriad of issues, lack of post-game content, stuff like that. But I do think like if they were going to cut the decks, this was the kind of way to do it because they actually did upgrade a lot of the models and whatnot. I still don't think a lot of them look as good as their Stadium counterparts, especially with like or not Stadium, sorry, like Battle Revolution, XD Coliseum counterparts. I do feel like a lot of the colors and stuff are washed out, but I do think that like this would have been a good game to justify it because Sword and Shield really do just feel like 3DS games on the Switch.
A 3D Pokemon, and totally fits the personality I always imagined it having since way back in the Sprite days. While we're on the topic of updated designs, I want to end this whole segment with a bit of
oh yeah, they did Electros dirty.
Is it just me, or have starters become way more human-like? I'm not sure if it's because of the shift to 3D.
I've complained about this on the channel.
Pokemon X and Y, I feel like the designs for starter Pokemon have gravitated towards a more humanoid aesthetic. Maybe it's
and they've gotten to the point where where you almost look at some of the starters and just assume they're friggin' Rule 30. What is it? Rule 34? Rule 36? I think it's Rule 34. Rule 34 bait.
Just that humanoid characters are easier to rig and animate. I'm not really too knowledgeable in that field, so maybe animators can let me know in the comments, but if you...
I think they know exactly what they're doing.
Like even the
because someone actually brought up Primarina as a defense. Like, oh, they're not all humanoid. Primarina is humanoid. Just because she has a tail and is a mermaid doesn't mean she's not humanoid.
Monster-based creatures have adapted human-like features.
Yeah.
Perhaps player data showed that humanoid Pokemon were way more popular, so these type of designs became preferable. If you want my theory, though, I'm pretty sure some of the higher-ups at Pokemon just realized half the fanbase are into that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's one more big change that came with the shift to 3D, and it's what some might call an over-reliance on regional gimmicks. I'm not trying to say I dislike the gimmicks per se. I mean, obviously I like some more than others.
I dislike
nowadays,
most of the gimmicks.
Like Game Freak think they absolutely need some kind of big twist to sell new games. I gotta imagine coming up with and designing these unique gimmicks every single new generation must be extremely time-consuming, and another reason why Pokemon games feel like they get less content nowadays. What used to be these fleshed out regions with post games full of fun, challenging extra battles have literally been replaced by Terra raids, which some people...
Yeah, and then they had the other raids in Sword and Shield, which I don't like this new idea of... Like, okay, I miss when, you know, you would actually have areas to find post-game legendaries. Lately, they've just been thrown into dumpsters. I made a whole video about this. There was the Ultra Wormholes. You got the Sword and Shield raids. You have the Terror raids. I don't like this stuff. Like, whenever there's an event, just throw it in the Terror raid. Like, I'm not a big fan of that.
We'll find fun, sure, but it only lasts a couple hours till you catch it, then you just wait till the next event. I guess my point with this whole segment is to illustrate just how much change we've gone through these last few generations, and what this constant innovation could mean for the future of Pokemon. Yeah. Even with all the great features the shift to 3D has brought the Pokemon series, I still can't help but wonder what a modern-day game might look like with the classic style. There are plenty of modern 2D games that look absolutely stunning and manage to hold their own even against major AAA titles, and it really makes me wonder what the series could have looked like if Game Freak continued to hone that art style. Maybe Pokemon games would have looked a little more like Octopath Traveler, which combined 2D sprites.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that 3D is just necessarily worse than 2D, and I can't disagree with that sentiment more. 2D and 3D are different styles, and one's not better than the other. I know, like, one obviously came before the other, but both have evolved in various ways. Like, you look at some of the oldest 3D games, they look god-awful compared to the oldest 2D games, even in some cases, right? Like, a lot of SNES games look a lot better than some of the N64 games. But yeah, 2D is not necessarily inferior. I don't like that idea that people think that. And if Pokemon did stay 2D, I do feel like they could have made it look really good. There's a lot you can do with 2D.
With 3D worlds and dynamic lighting to create a pretty visually impressive looking style. I've heard a lot of gamers dub this sort of look 2D HD, which makes a lot of sense as it feels somewhere between
I'd
retro
say
and modern,
2.5D,
and it definitely suits the world of Pokemon. But what if instead Game Freak decided...
That game looks dope, though. Like...
and modern, and it definitely suits the world of Pokemon. But what if instead Game Freak decided to scrap the pixelated sprites altogether and gone for a style closer to Nexomon, which uses... I
didn't really mention this, but I have actually spoken to Munching Orange in the past. He's a Nexomon fan, which you're seeing on screen now. I don't know if Munching knows this, but the new Nexomon games are going to be in 3D. And I'm very conflicted on it because on one end, like, I do trust the Nexomon devs to really make like a fulfilling, you know, content-filled game. But on the other hand, like, the 3D task on an indie studio, especially like with the open world and stuff like that, is going to be really tough. And it does make me worry that certain things might get skipped over in favor of like, well, it's 3D now. Like, I just feel like a lot of games, like, 3D is considered like content, so they end up having less of it. But I love the Nexomon style. I think Pokemon could have done something with what like Nexomon does, and it would have looked really good.
Is hand-drawn anime-style artwork while maintaining the classic top-down perspective. I've always had a bit of an obsession with Ken Sugimori's artwork, and just imagining all
this would be amazing.
Pokemon animated in his style does sound pretty sick, but would sticking with what they knew have really benefited Pokemon in the long term? I mean, if it saves production costs by reusing certain assets, then I say why not? They could at least try it out with a future remake or spin-off title. But I also gotta admit, as a fan of Black and White, I would much rather see the iconic landmarks of Unova remade in a more grandiose way. So
I'm gonna be honest with you guys, after BDSP, I don't really care for a Unova remake. Gen 4 was one of my favorite generations. Platinum was one of my favorite games. With how they, in my opinion, and I mean objectively in a lot of cases, bastardized a lot of the features present within the original Diamond and Pearl and just completely ignored features present in Platinum, I don't really care for it. I'd rather just play Black and White on my DS. I'm going to be honest with you guys.
I'd like to propose an idea for the eventual Kalos remakes instead. For being on the 3DS, I would argue these games still look pretty good, especially when upscaled on emulators.
Yeah, they do look really good upscaled. They wouldn't even have to do anything.
But let's not give King Freak any ideas here. I think Pokemon X and Y might just be the perfect games to become the series' first remakes. And by that I mean taking the 3D world and turning it back in time to the top-down pixelated era. I
wouldn't be against this, but I feel like there would be a lot of issues with like, okay, well, how do we port over Pokemon to me and stuff like that? I wouldn't be against something like that, though. That could be kind of interesting.
It'd be really interesting to see how some of the more open areas of modern games could be adapted to fit the old style. And how awesome would it be to get official sprites for some of the newer Pokemon? Then again, there's plenty of other games out there continuing to push the limits.
Oh yeah, Lumentail looks really good.
Blow my mind. So you guys keep doing what you're doing, and I guess we'll.
By the way, guys, if you're new to the channel and you're just watching this as like a Pokemon fan and you don't know about like what I do, I cover these games that he's showing on screen are games that I cover, like Lumentail, Nexomon. Obviously, I still talk about Pokemon and stuff, but I really cover these like non-Pokemon monster taming games a lot. So if you're not subscribed, what are you doing?
Let Pokemon keep doing whatever this is. To try and answer the question I started this whole video with, should Pokemon have stayed 2D? I still feel like it's up to preference, but if I absolutely had to choose, then I'd honestly have to say no. While I would have loved to see what the series could have looked like if they continued honing that 2D style, or even gone for the hand-drawn approach since I've always been a fan of Sugimori's art, I can't deny that a lot of that desire is driven by nostalgia. Without this transition, we wouldn't be able to interact with our beloved creatures in all the ways that the modern style allows us to. Pokemon Go would have never existed. There might not have been a detective.
Honestly, if Pokemon Go never existed, I feel like the Pokemon franchise artistically and consumer-wise would have been better.
Pikachu movie.
And I think Pokemon Go still could have existed with sprites.
Trading cards still have been as popular as they've become, and
Dude, I remember actually when Pokemon Go did that April Fool's thing where they used the sprite art, people were like, I can't tell which Pokemon's which. Like, there's people that actually can't perceive sprite art. I swear to God.
Importantly, would the new generation of players have been interested in a game that feels outdated in the eyes of modern gaming? You may have noticed I used the term evolution a few times throughout this video, both as a pun because...
So I also want to mention one thing too, like as adult Pokemon fans, we're obviously not considered the core audience anymore, even though, and it's become a meme at this point where like adults want to play Pokemon and kids want to play games like Call of Duty. Even though we do make up a very large portion of the fan base, I don't know if they stayed 2D and it alienated a lot of their potential younger consumers, and it like then they'd have to focus more on their older consumers who actually are a lot more faithful. Or is faithful the right word? Yeah, I guess faithful to the franchise who will buy their games for years and years to come. Would Pokemon be as financially successful? Probably not. But like, again, from a consumer standpoint, that might be a better thing, right? Like if Pokemon needed to really focus in on their audience to actually sell games, that would have been better for the consumers. So like, sure, it wouldn't have been better for, Pokemon, Nintendo, or Game Freak's bottom line. It might have been better for us, right? Because they would have really had to listen to what the fans want. Like now, a lot of people that play Pokemon, especially the younger generation, they put their like 15 to 20 hours in and throw the games away and never touch them again. Whereas, at least when I was a kid, we'd throw hundreds of hours just doing stupidity in Pokemon. You know what I mean? I don't know. You guys let me know what you think about that.
Pokemon evolve, but also because the shift to 3D really feels like the natural evolution of the series. And as I pointed out, I
do think that Pokemon going 3D is totally fine, by the way. Like, I don't like what costs it came with in terms of like content, half-baked features like Munching mentioned and stuff like that. I do think 3D was the way that the series needed to go at some point, but I just don't like the way they've executed it.
The real problems plaguing the core games today seem to be more of a systematic issue.
Yes.
Unreasonable expectations of releasing a game every single year, and the constant obsession with wanting to create new features every generation instead of improving on things that worked makes it feel like Pokemon is always taking one step forward and 2 steps back.
Exactly. Nail on the head. The problem isn't the fact that the games are 3D. It's the fact that the games are 3D, and because they're 3D, they don't want to do this. They don't want to do that. They don't want to actually bring the game to the same level of 3D that we see with other Switch titles. And I don't even want to bring up Breath of the Wild, because Breath of the Wild does have performance issues too. Visually, it looks a lot better, but even games like Mario Odyssey and stuff like that look better. And I think a lot of it's like even an art style issue as well. Like, it just doesn't seem like Pokemon is really like able to have the time to polish these games. And, people keep bringing up, well, the trading cards and the anime and this and that. Look, all of that stuff is self-imposed by the Pokemon Company. They don't need to come out with new generations every 3 years. They never used to. They used to do it every 4 years. They did it every 3 years. They changed it to make more money. Let's say 20 years from now, they start making generations every other year, right? Are you guys going to have the same excuse? Well, they need to keep up. They're making this problem, and then people are defending them based on the problem that they created, right? They don't need to come out with a generation every 3 years. They need to, if they want to maximize income on trading cards, on the anime, on this, on that. There's no reason why they need new Pokemon every 3 years, because they didn't before Gen 5.
Games undoubtedly have a lot of work still poured into them, and I can see the improvements being made, but
yeah, there definitely
just so
are.
slow
It's
compared
just
to
snail
other
pace,
contemporary franchises that get so many more years to polish and perfect.
And improvements in terms of visuals have been really slow, but again, like I feel like in terms of quality of the games, there has not been improvements really.
Games. I believe one day we'll get to see that open world experience we all dream of, but at the rate they're going, we might just have to wait like 10 more generations. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and please let me know if there's any other topics in the Pokemon world you'd like me to discuss. I've been wanting to create more analytical or video essays.
Yeah, so Munching, pretty much, really good video by him. Again, check out his channel, not that he needs my help, but basically, like, I agree with a lot of his points. I honestly think he's a little more optimistic than me with a lot of, like, what the changes that have been happening lately. I personally think that 3D has costed a lot more than it's given. The 3D itself feels kind of half-baked in a lot of aspects. Like, the games don't look very good visually. And then people say, you don't play Pokemon for the graphics. Well, when they were pixel art games, they were some of the nicest looking pixel art games in my opinion. But besides any of that, like, I'm not against 3D. I don't think 2D or 3D would have been better for the Pokemon franchise, with the exception of the fact that Game Freak just seems to be better at making 2D. So how do I explain this? I think Pokemon would have been better off 2D with who's developing it. I don't think Pokemon, it's necessarily that 3D would have been bad, like, regardless of who's taking over. I think Game Freak is just better at making 2D games. And I think that with the time constraints that, again, are self-imposed by the Pokemon Company, it causes even more issues. And I think that, 3D could have been good for the franchise if the franchise was being, handled differently, I guess is what I could say. But ultimately, let me know what you guys think. I'm personally just been really apathetic towards upcoming Pokemon games. And while Scarlet and Violet did have its moments and it was fun in certain aspects, I did also have a lot of problems with it. I thought Legends was pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. BDSP was honestly, in my opinion, the worst Pokemon game of all time. Sword and Shield also had a lot of issues, but I did find it still somewhat enjoyable compared to BDSP anyway. But ultimately, again, let me know your thoughts. I don't know. I think if they stayed 2D, we might still have seen a lot of the issues we're seeing now, but I think it would have been more manageable at Game Freak, just because they're really good at making 2D games. Like, 2D Pokemon games are really friggin' good. The only ones that people seem to have issues with are like Gen 1 and 2 when they were like a small studio. So anyways, guys, if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, all that fun stuff, and I'll see you next time. Peace.